So happy to see you again for the next session, coming up to the end of our Franco-German Forum on Energy Transition. We'll be talking about hydrogen, the level of regulation required for the energy transition. We'll be talking about financing as well, because that is the main theme of this day. So before we move into the roundtable, we will have another keynote address on the question of financing renewables in a zero marginal cost system. And I would like to invite Professor Kurt Rohring. Kurt Rohring is the acting managing director of the Fraunhofer Institute for Energy Economics and Energy Systems Technology. He is an engineer and a doctor in technology and computer systems. And I'd like to give him the floor now for this keynote, and you will be able to ask questions after the keynote and after the roundtable. So continue to use Slido to ask your questions. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm sorry I didn't understand what you said because I didn't bring my interpreting headset with me, but I'm sure it was a very fine introduction. Today, my job is to answer a difficult question, which is, can a financing project for renewables in a low-carbon context and a low-cost system be possible? Is it feasible? So I have prepared a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, in order to take you through this world. And first of all, I'd like to talk about the merit order mechanism, and then talk about the essential results of a study carried out by my institute. To begin, I would like to tell you a little bit about this institute, but I'll be brief. We have existed for 4 years under this name, but we have a long history behind us because we were founded in 1989, and I have been part of it since 1991. We work in renewable energies, and we have been doing so for many years now. We have a budget of 28 million euros for about 430 staff members. So I'd like to get right into the subject now on the energy-only market and the merit order mechanism. And then later, I will move on to talk about wholesale market clearing prices and the influence of low-cost offers and renewable energies that could offer some solutions. So to start with, I created a scenario that our institute drew up with our partners. This is a 2050 scenario. We had a target of 1.5 degrees, and here is the energy spread. 3,000 terawatts an hour of need have been identified in Germany. You see this on the right. This is covered by geo-resources and biomass, bioenergy. And on the left, you can see renewable energies in the form of electricity produced directly on the national scale using renewable sources, and also with hydrogen. Hydrogen brought in from countries that have more significant resources than Germany does. And you can see how these different sectors share out the use. And you can see the share of renewables with national resources and also imports. And this is what we hope to achieve in the future. You can see that in the future, we will have to have sector coupling. This will be needed. We have some sectors that use a lot of energy, and they'll have to use hydrogen and thermal energy. These two types of needs through decarbonization and sector coupling will open possibilities on the energy market. And this question will no longer be quite as dramatic as it is today because there will be ways to meet the demand, in particular through price flexibility on the energy market in order to guarantee the stability of prices. In this study, you can see that we are looking at the Copernicus framework. Copernicus was a study that was designed around the question of what would happen with this great strong volatility in prices on the world market and how this would impact this price stability once renewable energies are introduced with low marginal costs. So this is in the context of the merit order effect, which we see on this slide. Very quickly, I'd like to talk about merit order. This is a mechanism of bidding where the highest bidder for an energy packet will be able to bid at auction in order to cover that country's demand. And you can see if we inject renewables, you see this on the top part of the slide, at that time the fossil fuels, which can be expensive as well, will determine prices. And the price of energy, the clearing price, the equilibrium price, is fairly high. But if we add more renewables, that clearing price drops, and you see the distinct difference between the upper chart and the lower chart. So there are fluctuations in electricity that can take place over one single day. And if we look at the future and integrate more and more renewables in the electric network, you will often have hours with very low prices, prices with marginal costs that are close to zero. And on the other hand, if we inject very little wind and solar, we have very high marginal costs, and the price of electricity is higher. And these are the prices determined by the gas plants with extreme fluctuations that are difficult for us perhaps to imagine today. So these prices that go from close to zero up to 300 euros per megawatt hour. And this is what we defined in our study of high and low clearing prices. So what can we do to get out of this dilemma? As you see here, one of the parameters that is a deciding factor is the inelastic demand that determines the price of electricity. But with sector coupling, we have new consumers in their behavior are very flexible because they can store energy or transform energy in order to react to high prices or a system or excess energy in the system. This has an influence on the price of electricity. This is why these flexible users must be taken into account when you look at the logic of a merit order system, so that opportunity costs can have an influence on the price of electricity overall. So here is the big result of our study. Here you see wholesale market clearing prices in a German market arrangement. This evolves over the short term or the long term. You can see that gas turbines with the OCGT there with 2,000 hours per year, which is determined in electricity pricing. This has an influence on the cycle. The price of electricity varies between 300 euros per megawatt hour and just a few euros per megawatt hour. And this is spread out over the year. There's a big need for flexibility and for storage, but this enables us to bet on renewable energy resources. A few words on consumers. What is their influence? Well, you can see that battery storage has an impact on the most expensive offers. It reduces the price because it enables the users to be more flexible over time to store and then supply electricity at a later date. This provides a greater flexibility within the system. When we look at consumers, we can see that there are different, for example, pumped hydropower storage units, for example, that increase the high prices because they are not flexible at all. So heat pumps and air conditioners are represented here in a way to show that they extend the periods of high pricing. If the prices are a little bit high, that's favorable to renewable energy, but if the prices are too high, it's negative to the end users. Here we can see the aggregates for distribution of heat that are very rigid, but when we combine them with heat pumps and cogeneration units, we can achieve more flexibility in the electric system and in the heating system. This is what we can see here on these charts, where we see the demands are very different in terms of supply for heat, which can be covered by electricity. For example, here you have cogeneration units that can be decoupled or use or fall back on reserves so that we can adapt to the different needs of the heating network. All of these solutions enable optimization of clean systems and the electricity price systems overall. This enables us to answer all of the heating needs. If we include these different elements in our diagram, we can see that this combination leads to a reduction on the one hand during the full-on hours, but then other needs are covered as well, thanks to deferred use. And so the curve is smoothed out over the year thanks to these aggregate calculations combining electricity and heat. Other elements could be the transport sector, for example. You can see here that the new needs in the transport lead to high price periods. But there are more marginal transfers in this sector. In any event, we can see that the need for electricity to produce hydrogen or methane leads to moderate prices. These are marginal costs for hydrogen production because an electrolyzer is always in a competition with imported hydrogen, imported from other countries. And this leads to a moderation of the prices. Here we have 76 euros per megawatt hour, 67 euros per megawatt hour. And when we look at all these elements together, we can see on the left, this shows the representation of high, intermediate, and low prices. And then we have the low-cost scenario where we have offshore and solar. We have only 3,000 hours per year. So the conditions are quite different for renewable energy plants. On the right side of the screen, you see another mechanism that smooths out the curve between different energy markets, between France and Germany, for an example. We look at it with grid losses and without grid losses, with and without sector coupling. This is, of course, quite interesting for consumers. Let's look at France and Germany separately now. Here you can see very clear differences between the two countries in the clearing prices because the energy mix is quite different, of course. In France, we have power to gas and electrolysis, which can be covered by nuclear power, and this determines the prices. And on the other hand, you can see in Germany, with this descending curve that we saw earlier, that shows the price of electricity, the clearing price. Then if we look at the European scale, an aggregate of the 28 member states, we can see that there is a certain stability in the reduction of these prices. And so this is interesting for the financing or refinancing of renewable energies. And on the right, you can see different volumes, production volumes. You can see consumption on the right hand of that graph, the necessary volumes, and the orange dots are the average power price for renewable energies, and then you have the unit cost to consumers as well. And we end up with a price of 60 euros per megawatt hour. So this is a price that is intermediate with regard to the market and renewable energies. At this price, we could say we have achieved a balance, a kind of stability on the market, which enables us to finance projects for renewable energies. So what are the main takeaways? For example, we have seen the opportunity costs of hybrid cross-sectoral electric consumers can avoid the penny switching effects of very high and very low prices in systems that are primarily based on renewable electricity. We've also seen that high power prices still occur when open cycle or combined cycle gas turbines are partly in combined heat and power plants. But there are few situations in which the market-based curtailment of renewable energy sources is unavailable, leading to situations with very low power prices. So we are fairly sure that this would be quite rare. All units that can shift energy demand within a limited number of hours, that is thermal storage, battery storage, pumped hydro storage, lead to a smoothing of the price step levels. Power-to-gas plants exhibit a certain ability to pay for electricity so long as they can compete with synthetic fuel imports. And finally, variable renewable energy sources market values can be stabilized by the power demand of various direct or indirect electrification applications.
Adäquat und explizit darzustellen, dann lässt sich so ein Marktmechanismus dann auch designen. Und der letzte Satz sagt halt, dass sektorenübergreifende
And the last conclusion
Preisbestimmung in diesem
is that
CO2-Stromsystem
cross-sectoral demand bidding for price setting effects in low-carbon power systems will lead to stable energy prices and finance renewable energy products. Thank you.
I've got a question for you. You can maybe take.
I have a question for you. All throughout this day and in your presentation, we have seen that there are several options for organizing the energy system, and we can see that you have a very clear question, a very clear image of how the decisions should be made, and what, in your point of view, are the main regulatory and economic challenges in this area. From an economic point of view, it is important that renewable energies continue to be financed or refinanced. We can't cut them off at the knees by saying that they cannot be deployed economically. We have to devise stable market mechanisms to support renewable energies, and we may have to supply some subsidies to them in the initial period. Germany has a very pitiless approach in a way. For every proposal, there are 10 mechanisms, 10 financial restrictions that really are constraining. And I would hope that the German lawmakers would simplify these mechanisms so that people who have projects and evaluators of projects who are looking at financing could have a quicker way of seeing if a given renewable is economically viable or not. You were talking about simplifying. Here in France, we also talk about the need for simplification. Thank you very much, Kurt Rohring. Thank you very much. And now we're coming up to the round table on electricity, sector coupling, and hydrogen. What level of regulation does the energy transition need? And I'm going to call up our panelists. And as I've said since this morning, we're looking at the objective of decarbonization in France and to reducing greenhouse gases by 40% as of 2030, as compared to 2019, and 55% by 2050, and trying to achieve carbon neutral system. Germany is trying to reduce emissions by 80 to 95%, and renewable energies must represent 30% of final users by 2030 and 40% of the production of electricity in France and in Germany. These renewable energies must represent 30% of final consumption net in 2030 and 60% by 2050. That's why it's very interesting for us to have this roundtable in this context. And I would like to invite Elle Christophersen and Jan Lebot.
Our two other guests are joining us online, so please take a seat while we make sure that they're all connected and signed in. Thank you for being here with us. We'll do a first round table session, and then we'll join in with our guests joining us by satellite a little later. So here just as a quick reminder, you have headsets there to listen to the interpretation. Jan Lebot, hello, you're Director of Renewable Energy Finance at Société Générale. So just a few quick words to introduce yourself. So yes, I am the Director of Renewable Energy Finance at the Société Générale. And I've been there for 15 years, working specifically in that division within our bank. And I really focus on European-based projects. There are two main types of projects that we work on. We work on financing projects directly, so we fund renewable energies through loans that we allocate. And second, we also provide advisory services. So these are customers who wanted to be advised on all forms of financing that they could have so they can come up with the best sort of financing for their renewable energy projects. So the two main divisions that we work on. So obviously this is a topic on financing, and we'll be talking about that with you, but not alone. Now, remember, just with the microphones, make sure to keep the microphone nice and close because we wouldn't want to miss out on anything that you say. Now, Hella Christoffersen, thank you very much for being here, President of Strategy and Sustainability at Total Energy. So obviously Total is an energy that we know, but it's recently changed names, and it seems important.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Natalie. I'll speak English because I've been asked to do so. Yes, so Total has changed its name into Total Energies because we're mostly known as an oil and gas company, but effectively we have been investing in renewables massively over the last 5 years. Right now, we're spending $3 billion per year in solar and wind projects. So just 1 year, 3 billion. That's 30 billion over 10 years, and our goal is to be simply one of the top 5 worldwide solar and wind companies between now and 2030. We're active on a global basis, but also in Europe, and we can talk more about that, of course. Thanks.
And I'm sure you'll tell us a little later about all that works and that which doesn't work as well, but that's what we're here for this roundtable discussion. We also have 2 people joining us by satellite. We have Tanja Held. Hello. Can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Yes, so you are head of the Department of Legal Issues of Energy Regulation, Renewable Energy at the German Federal Network Agency. Could you just give us a few introductory remarks about yourself? Yes, so I am, as you said, the head of the Legal Issues Department for the German Federal Network Agency. Now, I am just a minority here because I'm surrounded by economists. Ever since 2007, I have been working at the German Federal Network Agency, and for the past 5 years, I have been working for the European Commission. And ever since the past few years, I've been head of the legal department of the Federal Network Agency. So just a few quick words about the agency for those of you who don't know it. It's a regulatory body in Germany, and we are specifically competent for the rail industry, for telecommunications, and for energy. Pretty much any form of network, major networks. And we are there to ensure that these different networks remain. We look at competition within these networks. And we differentiate between the regulatory work for networks and energy competition. So it's obviously part of our work is when it comes to traditional energy regulation. Now, while the energy transition requires us to work in other fields, in particular when it comes to the coal phase-out, renewable energies, and the like. So that's just a few very quick words about myself and my organization. And again, it's a pleasure to be with you, even though I can't be with you in person. Thank you very much. And we have our 4th speaker, Andreas Opfermann, Executive Vice President for Clean Energy at Linden. Just a few quick words about yourself, about your business, and you're specialized in gas and engineering. Yes, Natalie, thank you very much. So, obviously, I am here as Executive Vice President of Clean Energy at Linden. Now, a few quick words about Linden. It's a global leader for the gas industry. And we have been working on hydrogen for some 100 years now. Some companies see it as just a new market, but it's part of our DNA. For the past 40 years, we've been working on innovative technology for hydrogen, for clean hydrogen, in particular green hydrogen. We've also been working on all of the different possibilities that hydrogen can be used for when it comes to energy. So we have a 2.5 billion euro hydrogen industry that we're working on, and it's useful for lorries and hydrogen pipelines for distribution. We also have some 80 electrolyzers, hydrogen electrolyzers. So clearly for us, hydrogen is a key part of the energy transition, and it is something that we have already been working on for many, many years now. Well, we'll actually be talking about hydrogen a little later during this roundtable, so thank you very much for that quick introduction. And now it's time to get into the thick of the topic with Helle Christoffersen, because obviously we'd like to hear about the commitments that you have made at Total Energies, but we'd also like to hear about what works, but also things where that doesn't work quite well, and issues with financing, regulation, and the like.
Okay, Natalie, I'll do so. I will focus on Europe, since this is a French and German meeting. We will have more than 10 gigawatts of renewables, solar and wind, by the end of this year, and a little less of a third of that is in Europe. So we have a good perspective on what's going on a worldwide basis, and also, of course, on what's specific to Europe. Just in terms of milestones, we want to grow from more than 10 gigawatts to 35 by 2025, and then 100 gigawatts of solar and wind in 2030, which will indeed position us as one of the top 5 players worldwide. So what are the strengths in our humble view from being active in Europe? What are the strengths of the European Union as a renewable hub? I would say, number one, the clear commitment in favor of renewables and clear milestones. We've spoken about that the whole day with Fit to 55. But why is that important when you build projects? It's important because this clear commitment enables companies like Total Energies to take risk. And when we're talking about offshore wind projects, for instance, we're talking about carrying the development risk for 7 or 8 years. So that's a long time frame, and knowing that the continent is clearly committed to renewables enables us to take that risk. It also enables funding, and I'm sure you will talk about that later. A second strength is a strong investment in power grids and infrastructure, and that's both transport, that we've also spoken about today, and distribution, and it's both grid capacity and also interconnectors. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that as well, and it's a key topic for Europe's, I would say, sovereignty in terms of power. If I give you an example, in Denmark, the power prices, Denmark has a lot of renewables, but the Danish power prices are effectively determined by the dispatchable power that is available in Germany, because Denmark and Germany exchange electrons. So this is the interconnection, and Europe has done a fantastic job and will need to invest more as renewables, penetration goes up, but very, very strong asset in Europe. And then thirdly, I would say a regulation that is based on market mechanisms, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs this morning also mentioned this. Europe is supporting market-based mechanisms, and that allows for innovation and business models like corporate PPAs, firm power solutions, distributed generation, and so on. And that, of course, is supported by the ETS, so the carbon pricing, and by the funding of a lot of innovation. If I were to mention 3 areas where Europe can probably improve from our perspective, well, of course, Europe is not one country. So when you go country by country to build these renewable projects, Europe is still a patchwork of local regulations. We won't change that, but it's a fact, and it slows down the ability to, I would say, build projects. Secondly, on the ground, there are still a lot of bottlenecks, even for simple, straightforward renewable projects, solar or wind. It's sometimes very hard to get the administrative go-aheads to build. And in one country in Europe, we're experiencing now a delay that is 5 times longer than the official permitting period. And again, I'm not talking about complex projects that would, see opposition or anything. So there is an administrative issue in terms of hiring people, probably, to simply look at the permitting process in certain parts of Europe. And then, of course, the last point would be the mounting opposition that we are seeing in certain countries in Europe. That effectively means that it's becoming harder and harder to start new projects onshore and even offshore, and that's both solar and wind. And I would say that the consequence I would draw from that as a European regulator is, I think there is a strong need for a systematic space planning onshore in Europe if we want to achieve our aggressive goals by 2030 and by 2050, and also probably a well-thought-through offshore wind strategy, the same way as other countries with limited space have done, so that could be Taiwan or Korea, for instance. So, and that problem of space availability and acceptability of renewables is, of course, going to be compounded massively if Europe is pursuing its plans for green hydrogen the way it should, because green hydrogen comes from renewable and electrolysis. So, so that issue is something that really needs to be addressed, I think. I can say a couple of words on business models if you want. Or
On va pouvoir poursuivre, c'est parce que je prends le temps.
We'll talk more about that a little later. I was just giving you enough time to finish that point, but we will come back to you a little later. I'd now like to reach out to a few others with us today, such as Tanya Held, so talking about infrastructure, major need for regulation, and also the needs for electrification for grids. Thank you very much for that. I think in terms of challenges that we're going to face as part of the energy transition have already been highlighted. The coal phase-out, decentralized distributed production and the like. Now, we must develop these new networks that we need faster, but we also have to use all forms of flexibility that the market offers. These are the two really ways of getting there: developing networks on one side and using market flexibility. Now, we don't know exactly where we're going to get these new electrolysis machines from or how we're going to be able to find hydrogen. These are major issues that need to be tackled. Obviously, capacity needs to be secured across borders, but still within the European Union. And that supply security is so essential for the future. But to be able to get there, we need to look towards each member state of the European Union to achieve it. Because developing networks isn't always as fast as everyone would like it to be. Obviously, there's regulation when it comes to networks. And my colleagues over at our Federal Network Agency, they're doing everything they can to be able to make progress on all of these issues, but there are still many hurdles that are yet to be overcome. When it comes to flexibility, I believe that Jean-Michel Glachon spoke about the major issues there. And again, as I said, it is the second way we can really, truly shore up our networks. And again, there's a lot of heated debate around this topic about which is the best way to achieve market flexibility. And when we look at the indicators out there, I think it is the signal price. The clearer the signal price is, the better and faster we'll be able to enact change. As Jean-Michel Glachon said earlier, we really need to have smarter meters so that we can properly monitor change. Now, there was a little break in your microphone there, but we still heard you. We caught you at the end, so thank you very much for that. Now, I'll just like to turn quickly over to Andreas Opfermann. So this is a topic that we spoke about this morning, that of heavy industry, or just industry in general, and a carbon-free industry, which is another fundamental part of the energy transition we talk about a lot here in France and also in Germany. So what do we need from a regulatory side to be able to have a successful energy transition with industry involved? Well, thank you very much. I would just like to raise 3 points to answer that question. First, what can industry provide to help move towards a carbon-free future? So we have 57 billion invested every year in clean technologies and energy efficiency, and that was this year alone. But we need to increase that by 3, if not 4-fold, if we want to be able to reach our global warming targets, to keep global warming under the levels that we've set out. And this investment really has to come from industry, but not industry alone. And for that, for industry to be able to do that, we need to innovate. And nearly half of all investment up to 2030, 2040 will have to be done into technologies that don't currently exist, that still have to be thought up and devised, and that still have to be brought to full maturity. And industry really needs to be a driver behind that. But there's one area where industry can't have any impact really, and that's when it comes to regulation. So, for example, in terms of regulation to be able to go towards hydrogen, investment needs to be put in over a 30-40-year period. So all of that investment over such a long time, it can't really be borne by industry alone. And for industry to be able to do that, it needs clear indicators and clear guidelines and regulations within which way they can operate, so that they can have available hydrogen at an affordable price throughout the entirety of that period. But to be able to do that, we need to have strong regulation with a long-term plan, so that industry and companies have greater visibility. That's my second point. My third point, we've been talking about the European energy market. But I would just like to highlight the fact that a large proportion of hydrogen and energy policy and regulations over the coming decades actually are actually related to energy imports. And a lot of the policy falls back on renewable energies and not fossils. And so hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives would be a key driver of that new approach. And as we just heard, 60 euros per megawatt hour. And that's the price for electricity, and this is just the calculations that we're working on to go towards a hydrogen-based solution. And you can compare that to other forms of electricity, and it would break down to about 20 euros per megawatt hour from solar in Australia, for example. And in those sorts of instances, green hydrogen is set at covering 70% of all electricity costs. So what we're saying here is that it is of economic importance to focus on pairing up the different forms of energy. And when we look at our trade partners, and so being predominantly import partners who live in better geographies, better areas of the world, they can help us with that, and it can be a way of supporting development in those countries by importing out to those countries. And therefore, we can actually create a situation where to have renewable hydrogen, and therefore renewable electricity production, you could actually import it into a market. And all of the studies that we have show that currently markets have undersupplied. As has already been said by 2 previous speakers, there's a lack of supply. There's a lack of supply, and for hydrogen, we need to work on coupling between sectors, but also between countries, to have a more regular, standard, or a stable form of energy import, and it also needs to be done at a fair, interesting price. And something that we haven't really been talking about was taxonomy. We'll be talking about that in just a few moments, and I'll ask all of our speakers this afternoon about that question. But I'd just like to move forward on another topic, this issue of regulation and funding. So we spoke a lot about subsidies, more or less, but also the role that banks plays. So Société Générale, what role do you play in supporting all of these people who are really committed, such as Total Energies?
We are a driving force in the energy transition. This is something that we have defined as a priority for the group. And in this regard, Société Générale is committed to financing 120 billion euros up till 2023, with hundreds of millions of euros in green bonds, and also in contribution to direct lending. Société Générale is ranked number 1 with regard to green energy funding in Europe and Northern Africa and the Middle East, in the ranking stated from last June. In many different ways, we participate in the transition. First of all, and most obviously through direct loans to people with projects or financing projects. This provides us with a lot of leverage. We're looking at 70 to up to 90% of the project cost that we are supporting through loans, so that's a very strong impact. We also have consulting activities that we provide in order to support projects as they grow and become more structured, in order to allow them to grow and reach maturity. There are also other activities that we do for raising funds in a more innovative way. Crowdfunding, for example, through our platform. Our platform is called Lumo, or structuring investment funds, dedicated ESG, so for environmental, socially responsible, and governance, impact investments, and also, perhaps in a more technical way, our bank has been willing to mobilize within the EU to set up mechanisms to lighten up the different constraints that weigh down banks with regard to energy financing. It's true that in order to develop and make more capital available, we need to be freer. We talked a lot about innovation this morning, but I think banks are not considered as being risk-taking innovators. But is this, are innovations in these sectors something that you look at? What do you do? Do you go look at projects? How does innovation come alive for you? Well, it's a good question. Innovation is indeed something that often seems counterintuitive to banking, which of course is that we only finance a proven technology. And sometimes banks have a tendency to say no to financing innovation, but we are trying to improve our offer in this area. For example, offshore wind farms or something. As of 2009, we started some funding there. Floating wind farms. We recently signed loan agreements to finance floating wind farms. Also, some early interconnection projects between electric networks. These were not TSO projects, but private sector projects.
L'équivalent de RTE, en fait.
L'équivalent de RTE, ce sont nos réseaux, voilà.
Merci. Maintenant,
Now, if you look at, for example, the example of offshore wind farms or floating offshore, I think that how do we approach such new technologies? What we do is we get into it progressively. We put one toe in the water, so to speak, at a time. And you can see this in the way that France has organized or is organizing these floating wind farms, the earliest projects, which are industrial projects that have been made to demonstrate the technology on single prototypes. And then there's a second phase that's more progressive, where we have pilot projects with increased capacity so that we can show that it's possible to scale up a production, that the supply chain is there behind, and that the industry can be organized, and to start mobilizing banks so that they can become more familiar with this new technology, to understand how they can educate their internal bodies that are in charge of granting loans. And so banks can be mobilized and encouraged to give more secure loans, perhaps with perhaps more modest to begin with. And in this way, progressively, when we move on to bigger projects, and hoping that there's a broader deployment and that there is a bid for tender and so forth to enable this project to really come into full force, then we have already been able to understand the risks, to see that costs are driven downward, and that eventually we will arrive in a more mature field of investment with more secure or more traditional lending conditions. And we remain at the front line for all of these innovation subjects. So we did bring up the question of taxonomy earlier. Christopherson, and we talked about the taxonomy as a system that enables us to understand if an activity can be considered sustainable on the environmental and social level. So here's a question that's perhaps for everyone, but of course it is a very important subject. Several questions have been asked this morning in the chat, asking us to talk about taxonomy. Do you think that natural gas and nuclear power should be included in the taxonomy? Can you give us an answer to that?
The short answer to the question on introducing natural gas and nuclear power into the taxonomy, my short answer is absolutely yes. And why is that? It's because, you know, the more we invest in renewables, the more we see the need, at least short or midterm, to complement intermittent renewables with firm power, dispatchable power, reliable power. And the best example is probably to say, you know, what about a hospital? We cannot power a hospital with solar alone or wind alone. We need something else. We need to be sure that there is available power at any point in time, 24 hours out of 24 hours. And so renewables need a backup or a standby power capacity complementing, of course, the huge benefits that they bring, and we've been talking about that the whole day. We think hydro can play that role when hydro is available. It's not always the case. And then, of course, nuclear. If you want nuclear, can do the job because nuclear is low carbon, no carbon. But I come from a country that will never do nuclear, which is Denmark. I think our German friends have an issue with nuclear as well. And then what's left is natural gas. We know natural gas is a fossil fuel. Natural gas cannot stay in the networks forever, but natural gas is so much better than coal. Natural gas can be abated via blending with greener gases, with hydrogen. It can be abated via carbon capture and storage. So we believe natural gas has a key role to play as a backup to renewables. I would say, so long as everything we've heard about batteries and vehicle to grid and all the other availability technologies to complement renewables, as long as they are not available massively, we need gas. So we absolutely think the taxonomy should allow for a role for natural gas pragmatically, if not forever, certainly in the short and mid-term.
We could ask the same question. I talked about the objectives of decarbonization. We have the short term, the medium term, and the long term. Andreas Opfermann, would you like to answer the question about taxonomy? Yes, thank you, Nathalie. I agree with the previous speaker. In Germany, we need 12 million tons of hydrogen in 2030 and even more in 2050. So in some sectors like heavy transport, steel, chemicals, aviation, we need to decarbonize these industries through electric energy, and this will happen thanks to hydrogen. If we look at the German strategy on hydrogen, the 4 gigawatts from electrolysis that are planned in this plan are only 15% of our requirements, so 85% will have to be imported. This will happen through an exchange in Europe, imports from Denmark, Spain, so importing electricity thanks to hydrogen technology. Of course, there are different preferences for hydrogen of this or that color, depending on the country. Many countries say green hydrogen, of course, is the main objective. But look at Taiwan, for example, or China. They are developing a hydrogen industry thanks to gray hydrogen, and then they decarbonize hydrogen. The United States have 20 hydrogen production sites. If one of the sites were to be replaced by green hydrogen rather than gray hydrogen, that would demand a very high level of electric supply, which is not possible today. So we can see that regulation says that we can focus on green hydrogen, to have 25%, to reduce our emissions by 25% by 2035. And to reach this objective, we also take into account the CCS technology. In Germany, it's a difficult question. I think that we need flexibility about the different colors of hydrogen. We have to use what is best for us. Whereas in Europe, with regard to the taxonomy, I think the broader the taxonomy is, the better the industry will be able to advance decarbonization. Do you have a comment on taxonomy, or would you like to respond to what's been said so far in this roundtable? Yes, a little disclaimer. As we are the regulatory agency and we regulate the market in this field, we do not have an official position with regard to the energy mix or to the color of the hydrogen that we should use. But of course, we do think about these subjects. We know that green electricity is a priority, and I think that everyone agrees on that. But of course, the hydrogen molecule offers many applications that are quite interesting. in its many different colors, whether it's blue, green, or gray. It's a difficult question. Our perspective concerns the structure of the networks. That's how we carry out our analysis. For blue hydrogen, I think that you need 3 parallel infrastructures with an elimination pipeline for CO2 or other natural gases, because there are steam clouds that form in hydrogen technology, and then you need a specific infrastructure for hydrogen to transport it. So, could this be perhaps a transitory solution, or is it definitive? I don't know. I think this is one of the questions that's been asked today. How do we integrate hydrogen in a long-term and a definitive manner? These are questions that we think about regularly, and it's a very exciting debate to be having. What we can see is that natural gas will certainly continue to play an important role as an energy source in the transition, and we need to see how we want to structure this transition to reach our objectives. Jan Lebotte, would you like to add something about taxonomy, which could also be having an impact in finance? Yes, more broadly, indeed. The Société Générale has made strong a commitment for some years now in this area, starting with the Katowice agreement. The Société Générale was one of the banks to sign that agreement. We are defining and publishing an open source methodology that enables the guarantee of the alignment of the group's activities with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And in this regard, we seek to ensure that the portfolio of activities and financing are in line with the 1.5 degree target. Other commitments have been made, including getting out of the coal sector completely by 2030, and for the OECD countries and Europe, and 2040 for the rest of the world. And so this is by 2025, we will be reducing our global exposure to oil and gas extraction. So you can see that we have quite a significant series of engagements that have been taken, and this is in the context of COP26 that concerns states as well. Yes, exactly, and this is across different sectors, but also we have signed the Poseidon principles. There are many different areas in which we have demonstrated our convictions. And so we've been talking about regulation, financing. Let's also look at the economic model and how that might change. Kurt Rohling was talking about the need to support renewable energies. You talked about the developing of PPA. Helle Christopherson, what do you think about the maturation of this economic model as we see that there's more and more competition to these? Do we still need to subsidize, or can we see something else for the future?
We had a great presentation on, power prices and high power prices and low power prices and dispatchable merit orders and so on. What I would say as a renewable operator is that in Europe, as in other parts of the world, we are seeing now that solar and wind have reached a level of maturity, which means that they don't need guaranteed prices any longer. They don't need what was called feed-in tariffs. So more and more, not everywhere, but more and more, the business models revolve around wholesale prices, and we've discussed that this afternoon. And those wholesale prices can be either flat or can be guaranteed, with a premium plus, the contracts for difference. And then another business model is around the famous corporate PPAs, whereby an off-taker of the renewable power will commit to buy this amount of power over 10 or 15 years, at a given price or within a given price range. The price doesn't have to be fixed. And that's a very important driver for projects, because it enables my friend from Société Générale to have a good visibility on the cash flows, at least partially, those cash flows that are backed by the corporate PPA, and therefore it enables financing. And I would resonate with what you said. When we as a company invest $3 billion per year in solar and wind, through financing, we are effectively enabling 6, 7, 8 billion of projects, because these projects, they use equity from us and they use funding from banks. Okay, so that's one business model driver, and it's very important. The other one, which combines technologies, is what we can, call hybridation. So more and more combining solar and wind, because they do not produce at the same time of the day. And regulation can play an important role here. In Portugal, for instance, it's easy to deploy the two technologies together. It's not the case everywhere. Another form of hybridation is combining solar, for instance, with batteries, meaning that today, and it was mentioned this afternoon, batteries are still pretty expensive. We think costs will come down, as will the cost of electrolysis and so on. But right now, batteries will typically intake power or release power during 2 hours. So it's better than zero storage, but of course it's not enough because the sun doesn't shine at all during the night. But that's another form of hybridation, which is interesting. And then another market mechanism and business model which is very interesting, we think, is everything related to capacity markets. The UK has that, France has that. It's being put together also in Asia and in parts of the US. So what is that? It's about paying power to be available in case it's needed as backup or standby. And there again, the role of capacity can be provided by interconnectors, can be provided through batteries. We do that in France, for instance, or it can also be a gas plant that is paid to be available in case of need. Just a few examples.
Andreas Opfermann, de votre point de vue, alors c'est vrai que l'hydrogène est
Andreas Opfermann, from your point of view, it's true that we're talking a lot about hydrogen. We've talked about support measures. France 2030 program was just announced. This is a sector that we will have to continue to support for some time yet.
Ich würde sagen, Wasserstoff als Einsatz als Energieträger und nicht
Yes, hydrogen as an energy source and not as a chemical element
Renewable Energy Erzeugung vor 10 oder 15 Jahren. Das heißt, wir haben
is now at the same place where other renewables were 10 or 15 years ago. So this is a big challenge for large-scale development of hydrogen use. It's a technical challenge, and we have to scale it up more quickly than we did for other renewable technologies in the past. What are we talking about, basically? We're talking about 0.5 billion gigawatts of blue hydrogen, a project for green hydrogen that's about $1 billion. So we're talking about very big projects that need to be financed, as we've just said. So the question is, how can we bring costs down? How can we reduce risks on these big projects? At Linden, we are building one of the biggest gas plants. And we are working on a new hydrogen plant, and we have started drawing up projects that can be financed. Another thing is we are building projects where there is a synergy around infrastructures, for example, in the Gulf region. And we need to find partnerships. With regard to green hydrogen, for example, we have a project in Oman where we are doing exactly what was just described. That is, we are combining the production of renewable energy and hydrogen. We are also using ammonia plants that enable us to be very competitive and to transform green hydrogen in ammonia and then export it to Asia and in particular also to Europe. So these are some projects underway that can enable us to roll out hydrogen technology on a greater scale and around the world. By 2025, we will have to develop these projects, these major projects, which are needed. I said that we needed 12 or 10 million tons of hydrogen in Germany by 2050. So this is some idea of the scale of magnitude. In order to achieve this, we will have to build up new partnerships, not only amid industrial sectors, but we must be able to share the risk and bring the cost down as much as possible. We are well on the way to achieving this. We're working towards less risk, less regulation, and commercial outlets that will make these projects profitable. We are in a good starting position in Germany and in France. We are the leaders in the market with regard to electrolysis, distribution of hydrogen. The question remains, how can France, Germany, and the EU be competitive against the Asian market, where we have very aggressive competitors? And we also must take into account the social aspect of the energy transition. Yes, thank you. I can see that I have just a few minutes left to come to the conclusion. A lot of questions have come in. I don't know if one of you would like to answer this question, but we have a question about prices, and as the mix changes, do you think we will have we had very low prices during the beginning of the lockdown, and now we have very high prices. Another question about what level of nuclear should be kept in the mix in order to maintain prices at a reasonable level. I don't know if someone here is able to answer that question. There's also a question about the maturity of carbon storage techniques. So these are the questions that have come in. I would give each of you 1 minute either to conclude or to answer a question. Tanja Held, would you like to take this on? I think that with regard to the question you asked, I think I don't have as much to say as the others might, but my impression is that what seems important to me today is that the rules on the electric market need to remain stable and that the signal prices have to be adopted, because that is the only way that the market can be developed and the necessary investment decisions made, whether it's for greater flexibility or production itself. Thank you. So, yes, I can say yes to both questions. I think that nuclear energy can be useful. We saw that in the previous presentation. That enables us to smooth out the curve of prices. I don't think that Germany will reinvest in that, but France and other countries most likely will. I think that we have to keep in mind that the overall European market, there are different situations for import and export of power, and we have to enable the import of hydrogen for those who wish to do so. Concerning elimination of CO2 through carbon storage, we're no longer wondering if it will happen or not. We're wondering how quickly we can do it. We can't achieve decarbonization without CCS. We do have technological options available to us, and Now we need a carbon price system that will incite the best behaviors. This carbon price should be $80 to $100 over the long term, and I'm sure that at that price, the stakeholders would react as we would like them to. So there would be support from the regulatory authorities and political support. I think that with regard to carbon storage, in fact, we think that that is one of the most important technologies to keep an eye on. We are active in this area with the consulting missions in this area, and just as we have worked as pioneers in hydrogen and floating offshore, we need to see how we can best structure the different offer to make it bankable, so we can offer the best financing. Yes, when the technology is ripe, I think there will be a lot to be done. Yes, I agree completely with what my colleague from Linden said and with what you said also. CCS is indispensable. The technology is here. We need to bring the cost down. The signal price for carbon is very important. At Total Energy, we use an internal carbon price, which is $100 the ton by 2030, which indeed makes it easier for us to carry out economic studies when we talk about this type of technology. It's true for hydrogen, for CCS, and I would just add that Europe is lucky that we have oil and gas fields in the North Sea that are starting to be depleted, and Norway, Great Britain, and the Netherlands and Denmark are looking very closely at how we could combine CCS technology and transport and the injection of carbon into the North Sea. So I think that's a chance that Europe should take advantage of. Thank you very much for bringing up these questions of regulation and financing. I'd like to thank both of you here with me and my two remote participants as well. The forum isn't quite over. I'm going to pick up my things because I'm going to leave the stage, and we're going to turn it over to Patrice Geoffrand, who will continue and conclude with the forum.
Okay, to wrap up the fantastic debates we've just had, we now have the great honor of having Laurence Toubiana, who should be up on our screens in just a moment. Laurence Toubiana, who is current executive director and chairwoman of the European Climate Foundation. And there she is. It's such a fantastic opportunity to have her because she was part of the Citizens' Conference for the Climate. And so I'm sure it's a pleasure for Laurence to be able to wrap up today's debate. And I'm sure that you were also there in Glasgow, so you'll be able to tie all of this together to talk about the great European ambitions and also to see all the fantastic work that we can do between France and Germany. Thank you very much. It's so fantastic to have such a wonderful accomplice as yourself. So the organizers were fantastic, and really thank you for inviting me to be here. I'd just like to cover the major points of what we heard today. And really, they converge with the serious nature of climate change and the effects that will have in terms of water availability, the impacts that will have on everything. And also, it was good to hear about the cost, as well as the advantages and the benefits of the energy transition. And it's also fantastic to see the long-term impact of our ambition towards the energy transition. Now, I think it's quite clear that, given that the energy market is in crisis, we have seen that, well, it's not because of renewables or because of the transition. It's due to something else. It's because of economic recovery and also because of the instability on the gas market. And also, we saw that how we also saw how it was so important to be more independent and to do so through renewables. We heard from the European Commission that said that France and Germany, they are responsible for outlining the key priority areas, and that they will be essential in implementing the Green Deal and also in terms of energy synergies in the future. It was also interesting to see today how important it was to see the joining of digital solutions with the energy transition. And I think we should further integrate these different worlds. There are different scenarios that are possible in the future, but whatever the case may be, renewables, and I'll talk on this a little later, renewables are so fundamental, especially in those countries that have opted for nuclear energy and other countries who have gone for a different form of energy mix. Now, I thought it was interesting to see the shared interest in hydrogen. Obviously, there was one caveat, that it needs to be built in a specific way for it to be truly effective, but it was a key player when it comes to carbon capturing. And I would just like to say that, yes, we have technologies there to capture carbon, that's quite clear, but when it comes to storing, where it's stored, how long-term that storage can be, there are still a number of questions that remain unanswered. But it was good to see that, and we saw that when we look at current emissions from fossil fuels and fossil energies, we're really not up to scale where we need to be for the other solutions to be able to deal with carbon recycling, carbon storage, and the like. So that's what I saw. I saw that the crisis is creating a sense of emergency, that we need regulation, especially we need market conditions to make it all possible. So really, it was fantastic to hear all of that, because it's really great food for the thought for the coming months. We need to accelerate electrification. Major sections of energy consumption. So that's a huge challenge, because we need the necessary economies to be there, but also all of the systems in place to be able to adapt to that new form of energy. I would just like to make a quick comment about Glasgow. Now, I understand that Fatih Birol was quite optimistic about the outcome, but what is clear is that the Paris Agreement is working. Now, while Glasgow saw that we have fallen somewhat a number of years behind schedule because the United States pulled out. But we saw that, well, everyone was able to review their own clause, and we actually had the 2022 review date set in stone now. And it's all interesting because, especially when we look at the overall objectives of the Paris Agreement. Now, also on top of that, we have strong action coming from the European Union, and it's important because Europe is such a large area, and we have the 2030 carbon-free plan, which is a huge import, and it's not the case for many countries. And to a certain extent, we have strong commitments when it comes to pulling out of financing and subsidizing fossil fuels, obviously through G7 in the past, a number of European countries more of late, and now we have another of other major players. And we can see that the whole issue is now revolving around the slowly phase out of coal in the energy mix everywhere. And that was a fundamental conversation which we had. And I think that's another key take-home, is that countries tend to have accepted the idea, even though it wasn't necessarily easy to accept. So it's now a future issue, because we are understanding all the risks that we are taking. Also, in terms of economy and industry, I guess the concluding remarks about the carbon market as part of negotiations between countries, that's quite important, but also in terms of acceptability when it comes to have market acceptability, and that requires companies being involved. And I think it's good to keep a close eye on having a level of fairness when it comes to trade and the carbon credit schemes, because we want to really see if it will actually help reduce emissions rather than just having short-term cost reduction impacts. Quite clearly, progress is happening, but too slow. And I think the Franco-German partnerships and everything that is going to happen in the coming months with the French presidency of the European Union I think it's quite interesting because we have the Green Deal, we have the Fit for 55 package, we also have the ability for Europeans and Europe to really be part of the conversation, to show solidarity with a large number of emerging countries, like what is happening right now with South Africa and elsewhere. I think we can see here that Europe can really show the way forward. It can be a leader, it can be a role model when it comes to the energy transition. And I think the cooperation that we have with South Africa is a fine example. Also, what is being done with the United States and the United Kingdom. It's a way of Europe to be able to tie all ends together to really get things to work. So it can be there to help South Africa. And it's been there to really carry the conversation forward, carry the energy transition conversation forward with South Africa. And I think it was also a key player in Glasgow. And I think one of the great take-homes from it all was that, yes, we have a fantastic, well-constructed program with South Africa that which is well accepted at the local level within the country. It's supported by the European Union because it's a fantastic renewables and coal phase-out package. And it's quite modern in the way that this cooperation is going forward. And it's being really carried forward by France, Germany, but a lot of other European countries that are really championing that. And it's quite encouraging. For me, the Franco-German partnership for renewable investments is fundamental because we've got a new German government, we've got the French presidency for the coming 6 months, and I think that will be a fantastic way of making progress to reach our objectives, and especially working with what we see from the International Energy Agency is that we need to have a carbon neutrality by 2035. Obviously, that's the American targets. We don't know how they're going to be able to implement that plan properly, but what it means is that there will be no coal, lowest levels of gas possible, and a strong focus on solar and wind. So we have the Green Deal. The Green Deal is a Franco-German success, and we need to continue to build on that success. The shared vision of a shared footprint. Also investing for the future with focusing on building up skills and building up the new jobs. And we've carried out a number of studies and surveys with researchers and scientists, and all of it shows that the zero-carbon scenario for 2035 will be a fantastic way of reaching that, but it means just energy savings for households, and roughly 2 million new jobs by 2050, and 2 million jobs in clean energy. So what we can see here is that it's quite a positive outlook for the future. Obviously, there's still one question: how are we going to carry forward a transition in light of a volatile market? Because we obviously have the gas prices which are soaring. So I think we're going to be harder hit in the future. This transition won't be linear. We will face crises in the future, and we need to plan for them. There will also be some level of interference when it comes to fossil fuel markets, because they will continue to change in the future, and also structural funds that we mustn't lose sight of. Pretty much, crises will continue having an impact, so we need to be more coordinated at a European level to be able to find ways of tackling those crises as they arise. So we heard a lot of proposals today, and we'll come back to them in a few moments. I think the Green Deal has had a minimal impact given the light of the current crisis. We saw that the carbon price and the carbon credits is something which is very much present in Europe. Now, this is because we are trying to plan ahead, because it is all about taking into account the overall economics of it all. But really what I want to say here is that we need to show that it is of strategic importance when you want to invest in these programs to be able to fight against and stem future volatility. So we've got the Clean Air program, and that shows that electricity production from carbon-free free sources will account for a major savings, and it has accounted for major savings in the July to September period that we just saw. So we can saw that the energy market in Europe is one which isn't necessarily renewable favorable. So what we need to do is we need to make energy more accessible to all people. We need to have it more available to citizens. We need to ensure that everyone can benefit from them. There's 96% of Europeans today who want to invest in renewable projects, even in their local community, but on the proviso that they are involved in it, so that they don't feel like it's a not in my backyard type of situation, which is what happened with wind farms and solar farms. So people want to feel involved, feel like they are heard. People need to feel involved in community projects so that they can see local economy benefits. And these are the necessary conditions for us to be able to have renewable energy spread further afield throughout Europe. And to give you a perfect example, we have the energy co-ops in Germany. That's a perfect example that we could adapt here in France, and I think it's a perfect way to think about these new forms of grids, about distributed grids. And I remember from the Citizen Summit, we need to have certain levels of acceptability, because if people don't accept and embrace these transitions, then they will raise up barriers against it. And when we look at the Conseil d'État here in France or the court in Karlsruhe, is that they have said that the government aren't taking adequate measures. And courts will become more condemning in their decisions as we go forward, as governments do not take action. So the Green Deal, when we see how it's played in countries, is fundamental. So therefore, we need to have local activity, which is what I was mentioning earlier. People need to be involved. And I feel that as France takes over presidency of the EU, and obviously working with the German government and German people, we need to show how important it is to have everyone on board, so that everyone really strives to push the Fit for 55. So I see here there are a few major urgent issues to deal with. Taxonomy. Now, yes, we need to have gas, and gas is a major part of transition, but to see it as a green fuel, well, I don't think that we need to throw out all of taxonomy just because of that. Just remember here, taxonomy, it's a list of words that you can all use, but you don't have to use them. But what we know is that whatever the case may be, gas needs to be phased out bit by bit of the overall energy mix. But again, it really depends on jurisdictions. For in some jurisdictions, gas has been quite sidelined, and you could just think of what's happening in China, the way China is dealing with gas at the moment. Again, we mustn't lose sight of the overall objective simply because we're focusing too much on these short-term issues. So people saying that if we're getting the words, if we aren't using the right words, then it's going to create confusion. Well, I think that's just losing sight of the bigger picture. Also, I think it's a perfect opportunity to work on climate financing by working with major partners. Major partners in all of Africa. We have the African Summit in February. And I think that's a brilliant opportunity to be able to give African countries a solution to be able to deal with their energy needs across the continent, be it for their own industry, to develop their own industry. Obviously, access to electricity is a fundamental part because so many inhabitants don't have access to electricity in the country, but also come up with alternative solutions so that they don't fall into the trap of fossil fuels in the future. So I like talking about the Green Deal rather than the climate diplomacy because really it's so much more than that, and it's about putting everyone on the fore. And I really hope that we will be able to play a fundamental role and you will continue to drive forward Franco-German leadership in this domain. Laurence, thank you very much.
Thank you for this summary and for sharing some of the your thoughts about Glasgow, as Fatih Birol did this morning, and to talk about the specific responsibility of Europeans and France and Germany, and the upcoming French presidency underscores this importance. And you talked about the opportunity that is the German presidency of the G7 and all of these diplomatic levers that we may employ. So beyond this summary, I'd like to now call on Laurent Michel, who is Director General for Energy and Climate at the Ministry of the Ecological Transition, and he now bears the heavy responsibility of concluding this meeting. Hello, good evening to everyone. Yes, it is a heavy responsibility, especially coming after Laurence Toubiana, who gave an excellent summary with her very sharp skills. As we know, she has an excellent vision of France, Germany, and the world, and I wouldn't want to repeat what she said so well. And yet, on behalf of the Minister, I would like to say a few words about the energy transition. I'd like to thank all of the participants. I'd like to thank the moderators, all the teams that guaranteed the preparation of the forum, in particular the Franco-German Office for Energy Transition, and everyone who participated online as well. This was a big success, I think, for this fourth meeting. This is the first time in the history of the OFAT that this meeting has been held in France. Let's talk about a shared objective that we have, which is carbon neutrality in 2050, and also to quickly and immediately reduce our emissions. This is what's at stake. Clearly, is the credibility of our 2030 objectives in Germany and France and elsewhere. Clearly, as a first step towards carbon neutrality, but also because CO2 is accumulating. And it's not 2030 can't be our only goal. We have to start work right away. So we have to look at structural changes that will take some time to set up, but we have to start right away without waiting. We know that the path is long, and it's a long and winding road. We need to mobilize everyone. It's a European responsibility and Franco-German responsibility, and European cooperation will be key to success. As Barbara Pompili said this morning, perhaps she simplified a bit, but there are two main pillars in order to achieve our climate goals. First of all, reducing consumption, and second, decarbonizing society. This is, of course, decarbonizing concerns all areas, not just energy production. This includes agriculture, for example. We see this in France with the recent studies, where we have seen the electrification. We must have less than 40% of our final consumption of electricity should not come from fossil fuels. This transition is quite complex. It requires investment. It has their costs associated with transition costs, and without looking at it through rose-colored glasses, we could also say that it is an opportunity. It will enable us to become less dependent on fossil fuels and on their importation and the volatility of market prices. Although markets do have the virtue of revealing a certain number of costs and questions of balance and equilibrium. We don't need to throw the whole system out, of course, but there are different stakeholders, citizens, companies, corporations, can all be the winners in this energy transition. Once again, no rose-colored glasses, but we don't have to be fatalistic about it either. It is a challenge. It will bring about a revolution in the markets, the financing of different infrastructures, and decarbonized energy, renewables and nuclear energy, changes in a transport structure, coupling different sectors. And we're talking about financing energy efficiency as well. Of course, there are regulations that are powerful drivers. There are mechanisms for energy efficient buildings and so forth. There are mechanisms for loans, there are funds and so forth. But I think we mustn't forget that all of these systems of financing the energy transition are coupled. That is, it's not easy to finance something that is linked to the disappearance of something else. It's a complex notion. And we have this idea of hydrogen that has been brought up quite a bit. This is a whole new vector that has risen to the fore recently, and how we can use it in the coupled systems, renewable gas in various forms, of course, that could be used sustainably, gas from different sources. All of these are new paths forward. I think there will be changes also in our models of consumption, of urban planning, of housing, of transport, and generally production. Now, the government isn't saying that we should have some sort of autarky or some kind of austerity either, but we need to promote a circular economy through different modes, from the design and the production and the consumption of goods. And this is necessary because it's difficult to produce power, even if it's electric power, to produce it, to store it, to transport it. So I don't know if we need more decentralization exactly, but I would say we need more levels that can complement one another. It's true that we need big networks, we need central hubs and so forth, but we need to see what happens behind the meter, as it was said earlier. So it can be decentralized, but there also can be centralized regulations. And what's important really is the interconnection of the different markets among themselves for electricity, which on the European level will be virtuous for everyone. So all of this is changing, and it's quite complex. It's passionately interesting. And we can see that for the past few years, we have been resolving challenges, meeting new challenges, and it's hard to imagine what would be the regulatory framework for hydrogen transport in the short term. We transport electricity, and we need to use hydrogen there where it's needed. Others say no, we have to progressively couple it with hydrogen production areas. So really, it's a question of regulation, technology, and decision-making. It's just starting now, and we can see that there will be a boom in hydrogen use, and these are subjects that we haven't really come to say our final word on yet. So we can see that the public authorities have an important and complex role to play in accompanying this transition with regard to regulations, frameworks, financing, and we're not setting forth regulations to say what people must do or to define the necessary means or methods, but to help things evolve when things aren't working well, or when there are certain abuses or gaps or needs aren't being met. Then regulations can support the system. But of course, over-regulation is not something that we desire either. This is true on the national level, the European level, and on the local level. The success or failure of programs send a message to society. And so I think everyone in that society, whether it's local authorities, citizens associations, or business, have a role to play together to bring this transition forward through their proposals. And of course, we are here as the state to talk about macro scenarios, to talk about Fit for 55, the national implementation, major national mechanisms like ETS or carbon border exchange. If you look at the carbon border system, we can see that we need to talk about this with everyone who is involved in Europe and abroad to build it up and to put it into implementation concretely. This is true for everyone, and particularly here at the Hôtel, it is very interesting because clearly this debate has been organized with reason, and the debate will continue, will become more intense as we begin to have the delivery or the so-called the last kilometer. And certainly there will be a lot of occasions to talk about this together again, either at events organized by the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition. We'll be exchanging experiences, giving feedback, seeing what works, what doesn't. It's important to share and exchange. Even when the national systems, although we're neighbors, we're neighbors in old continental Europe, we're neighbors, but there are a lot of differences in our systems. We don't need to copy from one another, but we can learn from each other and learn from other countries as well. I will stop there, once again thanking the organizers, the moderators, and the participants. This was an exceptional journey, an exceptional day with regard to the policies, what we heard from experts in different fields in technology and economics. It was quite diversified. I'd like to wish you all a very nice end of your day. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurent Michel. We started with Fatih Birol, who said that now 80% of the emissions were coming from countries that were aiming for carbon neutrality by mid-century. But the question that we are looking at today is what can we do here and now? And I think all day we've been talking about that. What do we do here in Paris, there in Berlin, or in Europe? So I'd like to thank you all once again, even though Laurent Michel just did so. I'd like to thank the participants here at the French Ministry of Ecological Transition, the co-organizers, the Federal Ministry of the Economy and Energy, the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Franco-German Office for Energy Transition. A big thank you also. It was a hard work. A big thank you to the interpreters in the booths. There were 9 interpreters today in French, German, and English. I'd like to thank all the technical teams also who have been working here in Paris and Berlin. I don't know everyone's name, but I'd like to thank Sarah personally and Tim, who helped us, and more particularly, I'd like to thank all of you. Presentations will be available on the website for participants from next week. A summary will also be emailed to participants. Yes, I'd like to add to the thanks that as an academic, I spent tens of years organizing conferences, and I must say that they were rarely as successful and as smoothly run as this one. So I'd like to thank the ministry once again. And also 2 things that I sort of forgot. You will not only find the presentations on the OFAT site, but also many interesting publications are available on the site. And I'd like to say let's meet next year, most likely in Berlin. Thank you very much, and have an excellent evening.